Hello, Commissioner. Thank you for being with us, and thanks for joining us today for our virtual conference.
Chad, thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to spend a few minutes with you guys.
So a year ago, local governments and the state too were braced for what was anticipated to be a budgetary Armageddon. And when the local option sales tax collections reports came in for March and April, honestly, we were all a little bit baffled. The fact that many jurisdictions would realize a year-over-year increase in local option collections while businesses were closed, everybody was shut in. It really kind of defied logic. But I think it's fair to say that sales tax collections now have consistently exceeded any reasonable expectations we had at the onset of this pandemic. So can you kind of quantify for us, Commissioner, the performance of the sales tax collections?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I mean, it's been, I guess, maybe a pleasant surprise has been maybe a term you could use. Like the cities, the state was very concerned at the start of the pandemic, and we've been, as collections have come in, we've remained cautiously optimistic with an emphasis on caution as we move forward. Some of this consumption may be driven by, clearly helped by the federal stimulus money that's come in the context of sales tax in particular. I think the unemployment benefits have been a huge help in maintaining consumption of sales taxable items. One thing, I was talking with the Labor Department a little while back, and they were pointing out that they typically pay out about $200 million in unemployment insurance benefits in a calendar year. And this was in October when I was having this conversation, so not even all the way through the year, and they had already paid out $6 billion. I think things like that have certainly helped. In the cautiously optimistic has been, how long does that last, and what does it mean when those end? And of course, we're still monitoring that with the new bill. And to quantify it, state sales tax is up fiscal year to date, year over year, 6%, or about $300 million. Clearly, I agree with you, not what we anticipated when we were budgeting and looking at what this year may hold. So that's been great. Notably, local sales tax have been up even more than that, almost approaching 10%. So that's been wonderful as well. I think just sort of briefly, I think there's a couple of factors maybe playing into that. One is the impact of the increase in grocery consumption. And that's one area where the state and the local sales tax differ, in the sense that local sales tax applies at the full local rate to grocery purchases. State sales tax applies at a reduced rate to grocery purchases. So as we've seen that increase in the grocery store sector, it's sort of like the local sales tax has gotten the full benefit of that increase, and the state has gotten a reduced benefit from that increase just because of the reduced rate on those items. So another is the elimination of the uniform 2.25% optional rate for out-of-state sellers. That went away in October of 19. That covers some of this period, this year-over-year analysis. The impact of that is statewide effective local sales tax rate is higher than 2.25. So it's sort of an effective increase in that local rate when that 2.25% option went away. So I think those are a couple of the differences between the state and the local.
So looking a little bit closer at the sales tax collections data from across industries, are we seeing certain industries or sectors that have picked up as opposed to those that maybe have fallen off in this pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you mentioned that. While overall collections are up, and that's really great news, that does not need to be overlooked. That doesn't mean every sector has fared the same. Overall collections is one thing and important, but the impact on individual businesses and individual business sectors is critical as well. As one would sort of expect by just looking at the disruption that the pandemic has caused, we certainly see that in collections. I already mentioned grocery store sales are up. Restaurants are dramatically down, have been down through this whole period. Of course, it's evolving as time passes, but still remains down and has been significantly down over the last year. Sales tax from liquor by the drink down dramatically. Sales tax at packaged liquor stores is up. So, an obvious shift. What's interesting is building materials and durable goods are up significantly. I think a lot of people are staying home and they have been doing projects, home improvement projects, building out or furnishing home offices as people have been working from home rather than going into the office. So we see, the home furnishing and sales up, appliance sales are up. Some of that is driven by stimulus payments and unemployment payments, as I mentioned, but it's a lot of durable goods that have made up for the reductions in other sectors, not just restaurants, but obviously hotels and other amusements. So sectors are impacted very differently, even at the same time that overall collections have done well.
Commissioner, you mentioned the disruption of the pandemic. The conventional wisdom is that we've seen a purchase migration, so that as in-state sales have fallen off, they've been offset by a corresponding increase and online sales, so out-of-state sales. Does the data support that theory? And in fact, there has been an uptick in online sales?
Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, we track and report statistics based on self-identified industry sectors. The taxpayer identifies what sector it's in, and we collect those statistics and we report them monthly in our collections book, which is available, on our website for anyone to look at. But if you look at the remote seller category, it's up year over year by more than 100%. But if you just look at, again, the industry breakdowns, you can see the clear increase in the online sales sector.
Clearly, in the pandemic, there's been more of an emphasis and interest on the online sales and the transactions that are occurring out of state and those purchases and the ramifications, how that might affect sales tax. So let's go back to pre-pandemic, if we could. I think that, we had the Supreme Court decision, Wayfair, and then the state's response to that. And one component of that response was to require, obviously, those out-of-state vendors, those remote sellers, to begin collecting and remitting state and local sales tax. So that situs-based change, what indication have we seen? I know that one time there was the projections of hundreds and hundreds of millions. So has that actually manifested? What kind of measurements do we have to show that situs-based change in the aftermath of the Supreme Court and the state's response? What measurements do we have regarding that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I have some numbers here that I want to share that I hope will be helpful. Sort of to do that, I got to explain the context of the numbers because I don't want to mislead anyone. Wayfair was decided in June of 2018. And when that happened, we started getting new registrants, even though the legal requirement that sort of implemented Wayfair in Tennessee didn't really become effective until October of 19. Nonetheless, we had companies that were clearly registering, even for the month of June of 2018. We had some people file a sales tax return that had never filed before, clearly because of Wayfair. And they were doing that because they were having to do it in other states. And so once they're doing it elsewhere, they just included Tennessee. And that was a low volume at first. But the point is, it sort of started almost immediately at a low amount and then has ramped up, over time, even before October of 19. So what we have done in the context I want to convey is we have tracked the companies that are newly registered and do not have a location or other presence here. When there's a new registrant, we ask them, a couple of questions that help us identify them as folks that appear to be registering and would not necessarily have had to register but for Wayfair happening, right? Now, that's not an exact science. It's not an exact one for one. We're making somewhat of an inference that these are folks that no other apparent reason that they would have to register, but they are registering. So we include them in the population of new companies that have registered because of Wayfair. And so that's the population we're tracking. And that's the numbers I'm talking about here. Started seeing collections from that population beginning right after Wayfair. If you look at by September of 19, before our rule really came into effect, we were getting in a month's time about $10 million a month from that population. So, that's, if you annualize that, you sort of account for Christmas, you're up above $120 million. Then October of 2019 comes, our rule is officially in effect, and that number bumps up first to 15 million and then to 17 million a month. And then it sort of grew incrementally through that next year. And then the next really big event was in October of 2020. when we legislature enacted the marketplace facilitator law, which is really sort of the culmination of the entire Quill, Wayfair, online seller, getting online sellers to collect. Sort of the final step in that process. Many may be aware already, but just real briefly, marketplace facilitator refers to a company that maintains a platform, a website that is a place where they may or may not sell their own goods, but they're making that platform available to many, many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other small sellers to use to market and sell their goods on that platform. And so the marketplace facilitator law requires the platform itself as the company that's already handling the point of sale. They're already handling the financial transaction with the customer to be the point of collection of sales tax. And so it's really, in my view, benefits all parties, because a lot of the debate over Quill and Wayfair and online collection has been about when's it appropriate to require a small seller to collect your tax. And with the marketplace doing the collection, the small sellers are relieved of that obligation. They don't have to collect. They don't have to do anything. The platform's doing it for them. And for state and local governments, it's one central point of collection that's much more efficient and much more effective. And they're actually collecting for many, many sellers that would otherwise fall below the small seller threshold and wouldn't collect, right? So the small seller is not burdened, but those sales that are taxable, it's just we need an efficient way to collect it, are being collected efficiently by that marketplace facilitator. So that went into effect, and that, by the way, sort of swept after Wayfair, that swept across almost all the states really fast. I've never seen a tax law adopted across all states that quickly. And we were actually one of the last to adopt it, but it went into effect October of 20. So sort of that monthly amount of additional tax or tax that we're getting from this identified population of new registrants jumps in that month up to $55 million, and then $63 million the month after that. And then December comes along with Christmas and it jumps to $114 million. And then in January, it settles back down to that $60 million, figure. So I do want to be real clear that that's not necessarily all new revenue because of everything else that's going on. Now, we have people collecting and remitting that weren't collecting and remitting before, but simultaneously, we have this disruption, again, due to COVID, of more people that were buying locally at brick and mortar, and we were getting the tax. Now they're buying online. So this is not necessarily all new dollars or new revenue. I want to, be clear about that, because you got these two different things going on at the same time. But, importantly, when we had this shift from local purchasing to online purchasing, if not for Wayfair and if not for the marketplace law, a lot of these companies wouldn't have been registered and collecting, and that would have been lost revenue. In my view, we couldn't be more fortunate than to have had Wayfair happen, when it did. So if you sort of add all that up, again, going all the way back to June of 2018 when Wayfair was passed, it sort of increases over time, and you got these bumps in October of 19, October 20, and so it's grown. But if you take that time period as a whole, it represents about a little over $637 million in combined state and local collections, and that's $163 million, just a little over that figure in local tax. So we can already see a significant difference, and that is not, you mentioned appropriately so, sort of those early projections that were several hundreds of millions of dollars a year. I think it all sort of makes sense when you think in terms of those original projections really originated like a decade ago. And while the economy's grown in that time, certainly we've had a lot of internet sellers, so-called click and mortar, where they have an in-state store and a website, or some of the other large internet sellers who have, even before Wayfair, started collecting. So we had a lot of additional collection between those original estimates and Wayfair anyway, just because of the evolution of the economy and their business models and and all that stuff. So that sort of maybe blunted the impact some, but it's still been an important impact to get the ones who still weren't collecting. And again, I don't think it's hard to overstate the impact of retaining that once COVID happened. We had this huge increase in online sales.
So Commissioner, you mentioned the 600 some odd million, 130. What does that represent as total? Is there a way to quantify how much that increase, what it represents as the total picture out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's actually something I just started looking at recently. I find this very fascinating. The population that I articulated that are these new registrants since Wayfair and the marketplace facilitators now comprise 25% of all out-of-state collections, which I think that surprised me when I first heard that number. That's what it's grown to. So everything we get out of state, a quarter of it are these new registrants that we've picked up in the last 2 years.
So we've talked about that we do in fact have online sales ticking up during this time, the disruption that COVID has brought to us. And we've kind of gone back and looked at what the impact of the required remittance with situs, the impact of there. So kind of marrying all those together, and that's the kind of the perfect storm we're in now. The prevailing thought is that revenues in the more densely populated commercial centers of the state, if you will, have not grown as fast as you might assume when you look at the total growth statewide. Their percentage isn't what you would expect when you look at that total number, but that the smaller communities, smaller cities and unincorporated areas are seeing an increase. And that's really attributed to the obvious, if you think about it, that during the pandemic, you have people staying at home. So they're not going out and spending as much money for in-state purchases as they would. And that shift, we talked about, that shift to online from the in-state. I think people staying home also mean that they're not leaving those smaller communities and unincorporated areas and traveling elsewhere for their job. And stopping along the way or spending money in that city that they've traveled to. Instead, they're staying at home, spending money there or online. And so there's displacement and transfer there. And then, of course, you have the general folks in town. Even they don't have to be non-residents. The people in town aren't going out as much and spending as much money there. And so kind of a two-part question. Do you believe that there's a discernible indication that, in fact, the commercial centers are falling off more than you would expect considering the total, and that the smaller communities, outlying communities, have in fact grown? And if so, do you think that is attributable to kind of this COVID dynamic where you have people staying home, not spending locally or not traveling locally, or are there any other aspects that you think might be affecting this?
Yeah, I absolutely get where you're going. I will say, maybe start with a couple of caveats. We've not. I don't want to give the impression that we've studied this in depth. We have a research division that tracks collections, it does the work to report collections every year, and they had noticed smaller communities, smaller counties, areas that you're referring to as growing more than other areas and sort of more than before, and had mentioned that. And sort of getting ready for this call, we took a sort of a snapshot and found that sort of year over year collections, year to date, for all of the counties minus the 4 largest, had grown, their sales tax revenue had grown 13.4%, which is clearly higher than the overall growth rate. Evidence indication that clearly points to what you're saying. I mean, the fact of the matter is that that population of counties has higher than the overall growth rate. I do think it's attributable to the things you mentioned. I think also maybe some of the larger counties have more tourism typically, and with the impact on tourism, that same impact may not be felt as much in some of the smaller communities. So I think that may be another factor. And I think it's hard to know. There's so many, there's so much disruption and so many different sort of things going on between the impact of COVID on what people buy, where they buy it, where they go to make purchases. Is it near their home? Is it in a larger urban center where they may work? All the things you mentioned, are they buying at a store? Or are they buying online? It's probably difficult to know, attribute a certain amount of the impact to which different factor. But I think all of those are contributing factors that are certainly leading to a more substantial growth rate in those communities you're talking about than in those largest counties and cities.
Commissioner, with all the emphasis on online, then obviously the accuracy of those online collections becomes a bigger issue for governments, local governments in particular. So if it's a local store, you kind of have a feel and flair for where they are traditionally in their trends. So if something seems out of whack, you respond to it quickly, but it's not quite the same with the out of state retailers. So what level of comfort can you provide us as to how the situs is determined from reporting and how that process works? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So an out-of-state seller, an online seller, will complete a schedule with their return that has all the jurisdictions, and they are required to break down their sales per jurisdiction. They'll do that using a jurisdictional database, and that may be their own. And some of these are really some of the biggest companies around and very sophisticated and have very sophisticated systems. So we feel, comfortable in those, and we audit those companies. Others can use the jurisdictional database that we at the state provide, which we feel very confident in. And one of the questions we get sometimes is, well, is this just based on zip code? And zip codes cross jurisdictional boundaries. And I want to assure everyone it's not based on zip code. It's much more granular than that. It's based on actual physical address. It uses GIS technology, to do that. I think the bulk of the money is covered by jurisdictional databases, either the company's own or their big software vendors and sales tax collection service providers that have sophisticated jurisdictional databases, and we have our own that we make available. What we do sort of in looking at that on the back end, we do look at and identify returns that are obviously not correct, where it's all in one jurisdiction, or it's all only in a handful, or it's all just at the county level and not at the city level. And we have and do identify those readily, and we work with those directly with those taxpayers to get them doing it right and to fix the one, give us information so we can fix the ones that they filed. They've remitted the right amount of money. They just need to give us the correct information to send it to the correct jurisdiction. So that does happen where we review those and find ones that they're just obviously not doing it correctly. And I feel good about what we've done to identify those and fix them. That sort of leaves, well, okay, somebody's filling it out. It generally looks like they're doing it right, but how do I know that at the margin, that they're getting all the amounts exactly right for each jurisdiction? And there's really no way for us to make that determination by looking at their return. It's really just subject to auditing like any other compliance. And so we don't audit all taxpayers every year. We audit a percentage of taxpayers, each year. But it's really an audit function. One thing I think is important to convey, this is the city's tax and the local government's tax that they impose. We simply have the opportunity, the obligation, the duty to collect that for you. And we work hard to do that timely and accurately, and that's a service we provide to you guys. But it's your tax, and the point of saying that is that information is available to the cities for the taxpayers in their jurisdictions. And the way to access that is through what we call the Revenue External Portal, and that's available through TNTAP, our outward-facing system, and it's administered by our Financial Control Division. If you don't have access to that, I would encourage you to get log on and get access to that, because that's the way to look at the return data by taxpayer in your jurisdiction. And Financial Controls has put out, they have a PowerPoint, which I'd be happy to provide, that sort of a manual for how to look at this online. I would just encourage you, that's a great resource I would encourage folks to use, so they can see, they should be able to and can see the data about the taxpayers and the collections in their individual jurisdiction.
Well, Commissioner, thank you so much for being generous with your time and joining our conference today to speak to our membership, the city officials out there. The TML, we always enjoyed a great working relationship with you in the department, always responsive and very helpful. It's been great information today. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Chad, thank you very much for the invitation. It was really great to speak with you. Always enjoy working with you. And our relationship with TML and with the cities is incredibly important to us. And I just appreciate the opportunity to be here today, spend some time with you.